Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on how to build an effective performance management strategy. To those of you who are used to being on a few of these webinars with Morpay and Michelle, you'll most likely be a bit familiar with what we do and a few of the topics that we sort of cover. But just to give you a bit of an introduction as to what the session is going to cover today, we're going to go into why performance management matters, how to go about creating an effective performance strategy, getting the most out of performance reviews, managing underperforming employees, tools to help with the performance management process, as well as a live Q&A at the end with Michelle. We're going to have some time set aside at the end of the session as usual today to go through any of your questions, but got some instructions there as to how you can ask them throughout the session, and then once we come towards the end, we should have a batch of them to go through. Yeah, please feel free at any point, by the way, if for any reason, we will be sending out a recording after the fact. So yeah, please don't have any worries if you have to jump off at all. But to give you a bit of a, as I said, if you're not familiar with us here at Morpay and Natural HR, so Morpay have been a market leader in payroll software for more than 50 years. And effectively this year, to combine the best of breed in HR software and payroll software, Morpay actually acquired Natural HR to provide the complete all-in-one HR and payroll solution. Now, to give you a bit of background on Michelle, who's going to be taking you through the performance management process today. She heads up our HR services department here, which includes employment law, advice, etc. She's got more than 15 years experience in the sector and is CIPD qualified. And yet has an acute understanding of the challenges that HR professionals face. So there's no one really better placed to talk through this today. But yeah, without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to take you through why performance management matters.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to everyone for joining this morning. So in terms of performance management then, the performance management process is something that's been around for many years now, and most of us who are on this call are familiar with the basics and the foundations of it. We've all been through it as employees, and most of us will have been through it as either managers or as HR people. But it is a process that should be constantly monitored, adjusted and improved. The ultimate aim of the process is to support the business in achieving its goals through its people, and that is the crux of this whole presentation, is how we help you do this. So there'll be some things in here that'll be really familiar to you and that you've known ever since you started doing performance management reviews in the various guises that they've been over the years. But it's really sort of taking the opportunity to step back and think about it and think about the processes that you've got in place. Are they current enough? Are they modern enough? Have they been adjusted with changing times, with everything that we've all been through over the past few years in terms of COVID, the way people are working now? It's just really an opportunity to revisit all of that. So how the strategy helps an organisation, its people then. It means that employees are comfortable with what they need to do to succeed. We all as human beings like to know what's expected of us and how to do that. It's kind of a fundamental need of ours. And the performance management puts that structure in place for us. It also helps drive career progression, which is certainly very important to a lot of people. For both a business and for their employees, it helps identify skills gaps. So whether you're looking at individuals or your team, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, it can help identify where there's skills, training or additional experience that needs to be brought in, and it helps a business stay on top of all that. It is something that really is important in engagement for employees, and I've got some interesting stats on that I'll talk about later, but it can also really help with that engagement and do things like reduce turnover, and as a result, reduce recruitment costs. There is always a cost benefit to things like this, and it's important not to lose sight of that, as well as all the other good stuff you get from it. It can ultimately increase ROI. I think the stat there at the below saying, despite all these benefits, according to a Clear Review survey, 65% of HR directors actually still put performance reviews on the back burner, and this was a stat from 2022, and I don't think it'll be particularly different now. There are so many other things that get in the way of everyday life, and there's sort of immediate things that we need to look at as businesses, but it's important not to lose sight of this. So the thing that I'd ask you to question yourself whilst you're listening to this webinar today is, do you think your business is doing what it can do with performance reviews. Are you doing performance reviews? There are some businesses that have decided not to do them. If you're not doing them, why are you not doing them? But even if you are doing them, are you getting the best out of them? Are you making the most out of this process? I think with the fact that most of us are familiar with what it means, it can be easy to become a little bit complacent. We've got the process in place, we've got the paperwork, we tick the boxes once or twice a year, job done. But there is so much more to it than that, and that's what I want to get you thinking about today. So on to the next slide then. We've sort of said the strategy definitely helps an organisation and its people, but why is it so important? And these are some of the stats that we've pulled out that hopefully you can take away and think about. And this is thinking about it from both the manager side or HR and from the employee side. In a survey by Gartner, 95% of HR managers expressed some kind of feeling that they were unhappy with traditional performance review processes. And these would be the processes where you once a year sat down with your employee, talked about their performance over the previous year. Probably not much happened in between. And I think that it's fair to say that most of us think that that has had its day and there's more to it than that. But this stat here says 95% are feeling unhappy with traditional performance review processes. 80% of workers, when surveyed by Deloitte, actually said that whatever their review process was, they felt dissatisfied with it. And a bad process can be worse than no process at all, because if you've got a process in place that people are finding cumbersome, are finding almost pointless, then it is going to have an impact on them. And sometimes just small changes to that process, which we'll talk about in a bit, will really help. And then stats from the Harris Group actually said 24% of employees said they would consider leaving their roles if they didn't feel their managers were providing adequate performance feedback to them. And this is where it is so important for employees to know how they're progressing, what they're doing, am I making a difference? And we need to think about how we answer those questions using performance review processes. And then on the next slide then, it's talking about sort of the cut and dry of it saving businesses money and the actual financial impacts that having performance management processes and effective ones in place can have. So 94% of workers in a LinkedIn report said that they would stay at their company longer if their employer invested more in their career. And this is one way that you can do that, because we'll talk about things like performance development plans that go hand in hand with performance reviews. And so that's a huge amount of employees saying how important it is to feel that they're being invested in, they know where they stand and they know what to do to help their career go forward. It's thought that 5 to 10% of increase in productivity when an employee understands exactly what's expected of them, and 44% better retention in companies who have some kind of continuous performance review process. And all of this again goes straight to the bottom line, as well as all the extra benefits that you would get with it. So the next part then is, we've talked about how what you need to do and why it's important, and I think we would probably all agree, and that's why you are here on this call today. But how do you create an effective performance management process? I've already touched on this, but I think it is fair to say that the traditional performance management process, like just an annual or a biannual review, aren't really cutting it anymore. There's a lot of talk out there, and there's lots of research that you can find online where we're talking about continuous performance management, and people agree that this is the way forward. But how do you get that working in your organisation? How do you step away from having that structured, strict process of once a year? And how do you sort of break the shackles of what we've kind of all been used to for so long? It really does require a bit of a shift in culture. So this probably isn't going to happen overnight, but there are small steps that you can put in place to help do this. So the 4 points that we've got on here are kind of the basics of the performance management, and even in a more of a continuous performance management process, you still need these basics in place for it to work. The objectives, we've all heard this countless times, so I won't labour the point, but making sure that the objectives are smart and the employee knows exactly what they need to do, how they need to reach it, how it's going to be measured. think a key thing is thinking about scheduling the reviews. Now, the thought here is to schedule routine, less formal one-to-one meetings more regularly. So that maintains a real open line of communication with employees and their managers, which creates opportunity to provide much more feedback on an ongoing basis. It helps with visibility on progress, and it makes it easier to identify any issues that are happening and maybe even pick them up before they become an actual problem or something more serious. You can support continuous performance management with things like social recognition amongst employees so that they can be encouraged and motivated to recognise each other, and then they'll be motivated by the positive feedback from peers. And then it can help you as managers and businesses to take that into account when reviewing someone's performance. It's something that most people are used to now in terms of social media feeds. So having something like this in your organisation, a way, even just to put a thank you, a place where whether it's on your intranet, whether it's on your HR system, whether you've got a separate recognition app, for people to be able to give a shout out and a thank you. And then finally, thinking about professional development plans. So employees as part of this should be allowed to think about, okay, this is what I'm doing now, this is how I'm performing now, and you need to give me feedback, and I will feedback as well. But what next for me? This is where I want to go. How do I get there? What do I need to do? What are the steps? What is it that I need to do, and what is it that you can do to support me? And those 4 things are really important when you think about continuous performance management. As I said, these aren't things that are going to change overnight. It's not that you could sort of wave a magic wand, wake up tomorrow morning, and everyone will start doing these things. But there are little steps that you can take to start changing that culture and make performance management something that is talked about on a more regular basis. I think it's important, though, to say that a clear checkpoint or a clear point in the year is always a good idea. You might still have that once a year where there's a formal, okay, we are looking at the rest of the year, and we are looking at, the year gone by, and going to give you an appraisal grade or however you work it. But that process is going to be a lot easier if you've been talking about it all year. And there should be much more regular feedback sessions that are happening in between that. So on to some techniques then that can help you create that process. And there are 6 techniques that we've talked about in terms of how you can do this. So the first is about KPIs, making sure that you've got KPIs in place that are going to measure how well a project team or individuals are doing. Because always remember that the performance of an individual does not stand on its own. It is part of a larger plan and a larger budget and a larger objective. But make sure that those KPIs are consistent, that an individual knows what they're doing, but they also know how that impacts the rest of the business. But that means that there is going to be data-driven performance review conversations, even those smaller conversations that happen in between. So well-defined KPIs are vital to providing a really clear picture of what an employee needs to do, what their current level of performance, and it will show what needs to happen going forward. I think it's important that employees must feel that the appraisal is a regular thing. It will become much more of a natural process if these meetings are happening once every 2 weeks, once every month, whatever you decide is the appropriate thing. But it allows for much more fair, honest and constructive feedback. And the key part here is that it's a 2-way conversation between an employee and a manager. As it says there, and I've kind of already mentioned, if it's not like this, it does feel like it is just a tick box exercise. Tick, we have given someone a grade for the past year, we'll wait again till next year. And it's just really about making sure that this is something that starts to feel a bit more natural. It's also important to think about how people are doing things. So it's very easy to look at a performance review process and focus on what does somebody need to do, what targets do they need to hit, what do they need to do in their job to make that job a success. But there is still an important element that's around behaviour and how people approach those tasks that they're doing. It is more difficult to do because it is more subjective, and it can feel difficult to talk about people's behaviour. But I'm sure that we can all think about a time when we've seen an employee or even a team member, a fellow team member, who is hitting all their targets, is doing everything that's asked of them in black and white, but their behaviour and attitude is not the right thing. and that can really create a bad environment in an organisation. So competence matrix are a really good way of looking at that holistic view of the employee and looking at it holistically across the organisation. And you can come up with ways to make it more objective, for like attaching score ratings to competencies and how you can do that and map out what competencies are important. And it's like what skills are required to make that a successful role. And I think it's a really important element to consider. So the next three techniques that I just want to talk about then, one is around management by objectives. So this is about defining specific objectives and setting out how each individual achieves their objectives. But it's powerful that specific work that must be done one step at a time. It helps create a culture of working towards common goals. And this is something that's really important to think about. Already touched on it slightly, but when an individual is focused on achieving their goals that's relevant to them at that point, what does that mean for the wider organisation? How can they see that what they are doing over here is impacting the larger organisation? And if everyone is being managed by objectives that kind of collectively come together, they'll always be quite different. It really is going to make an individual feel like they are contributing. And it helps you as a business sort of set a right standard across the organisation. Personal development plans are also a really important part of this. So as I said before, it's about thinking about the future as well about what's happening now. What are the goals for their future performance and what actions are the business going to put in place to support their development? One of the stats I talked about was that career development is so important to individuals in terms of engagement, and wrapping this up around performance management and thinking about the future as well as the past and as well as the present. It really does help engage individuals, and it sits really nicely here talking about how the business will help them, what they need to do, and it helps that feel that the business is invested in them as a person, and then they will know the role that they need to play in terms of being successful for themselves but for successful for the business. And then the last point is thinking about 360 feedback. Again, this is something that's been around for many years, used in kind of, I've been in businesses where it's been used a lot, I've been in businesses where it's not been used at all. But I still do think that there's benefit in allowing that 360-degree feedback. The recognition approach that I just mentioned on the previous slide, that is some form of 360-degree feedback, that you're allowing people to sort of shout out the good stuff and say, thank you for doing that, you worked really well in this situation. But a proper 360-degree feedback process allows for both the positive and the constructive feedback for individuals. And it can be really powerful if used in the right way, used with the right intent, and everyone knows where they stand with them. But helping team members grow in identifying areas for improvement when they're looking at the full range of people that sit behind them and sit around them in the organisation, that's going to really help move them forward. So on to the next section then, which is around planning performance review processes. This is whether you're planning an informal one or the more formal catch-up. Just a couple of points to kind of pinpoint and allow you to think about how best to approach them. Make sure that both the manager and the employee have got the right time to prepare for it and they know roughly what the agenda is going to be. If you are doing more regular sort of one-to-ones where you talk about feedback, try and make sure that you've got a consistent agenda and it just becomes a natural process. I've already talked a little bit more about KPIs and continuous performance reviews, but it's really sort of making sure that when you're doing those performance reviews or you're sitting down in those one-to-ones or however you phrase them or however you position them, that you are talking in that language, you are talking about those clear KPIs, you are talking about the openness and the value that you get from that openness in having a continuous conversation about how to move things forward and making sure that there's a system of measurement in place. The really key point to remember is kind of the second point down on the left-hand side, which is remember this is not any form of disciplinary meeting. And by that, it might sound something really obvious, but by that, I mean, it is a two-way process. It isn't a conversation that's just the manager telling the employee, this is what you've done well, this is what you've not done well, and this is what you need to do going forward. That is only part of the conversation. So remember to approach the meeting in that way. I've kind of emphasised sort of being dramatic to emphasise the point about it not being a disciplinary meeting, but make sure that you recognise that reviews can make employees feel nervous and worried. They might be worried that they're going to be told something that they didn't know or that they weren't expecting. There might be sort of just a general anticipation or worry. So make sure that there is a clear communication even beforehand that this is going to be a two-way process, and that it really just is about open and it's an open way of talking about it, and put your employees at ease. That's the main thing to do. So the next part then, the next section, is talking about managing underperforming employees, because obviously there's the great side of being able to reward and recognise the employees that are doing really, really well in your organisation. But there are always going to be people who are underperforming. How do you handle that situation alongside your performance review process, and face up to those kind of difficult conversations? So talking about taking action, the first thing I want to say before I sort of go through about how you take action, if you have some form of annual or biannual review process and that's how your business works, the key thing is do not wait until that final formal meeting to tell an employee that they are underperforming. This may sound like it's really obvious, and to some people it is, but I have seen examples of where an individual has been given a sort of a reduced grading because they've not been doing particularly well, and it's completely shocked them and bowled them over, and they had no idea that this was coming because the manager had not had any kind of conversation about any kind of concerns in the first place, and this can lead to really difficult situations. And you know, I've probably seen it happen too many times, and if we're all honest with each other, we have probably seen it in our careers as well. So it's really important to think about how that looks in terms of a sort of a more continuous improvement process. But before you take action, make sure that you've got as much information as possible to make this a meeting with an intent for a positive outcome. It is such a difficult conversation talking to someone about underperformance. But you should go into those meetings, even at the start of those conversations, with the view that you are trying to help them turn this around. It isn't a way to get them out of the organisation, although that sometimes does end up being the case, and I'll talk a little bit more about the capability process shortly. But the aim of this is to try and help them improve and to get them where you need to be. You are going to be in a much better position if the employee turns it around, rather than if they are sort of defensive, they don't improve, they're not listening to you. Try and enter it with a positive focus for the outcome. So the things that you need to have been thinking about then is, have you been tracking their performance against measurable goals? Have you got something objective to talk to them about? Think broader. Are you aware of any issues in their personal life which may be impacting their ability to deliver? We all have home lives, they all look different. We all have times that are good outside of work, times that are difficult outside of work. Sometimes we can control the impact it has, sometimes we can't. And it is just thinking, have I got all the information or what the employee wants to tell me about, but let them know that you're there for support. Have there been any previous meetings where issues have been raised and haven't been followed up and addressed? And that's on both sides, and try and make sure that that is covered. And make sure that if you are inviting an employee to talk to them about their underperformance, that you give them time to prepare. So it might be that you have an initial conversation and you say, look, these are the issues that I've got at the moment. You might say, do you know what, it might be best to sort of, we'll close this meeting now and reconvene in a couple of days to give you a chance to think about it. Just try and read how the employee reacts to it. And then the biggest thing is thinking around how you can improve it. And it isn't just you as the manager or HR saying, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, end of conversation. Jointly come up with ideas for improvements, goals that can be set. If you can get the employee to buy into that and understand that your aim and goal of this is to help them improve their performance, you're much more likely to get a positive outcome. So then on to the next slide, just to talk a little bit more about how the process works. Just put a few steps on here for you really to think about it. What I would say though is that if you are in any underperformance process and it looks like it's potentially going formal, or even before then, do make sure that you speak to either More Pay in the HR advice team, or you speak to whoever your HR professional is, because every single underperformance process for an employee is going to be slightly different. You'll have the sort of the standard that you'll follow, but their situation is probably going to be unique, and it's always good to take advice. But the main things here are thinking about identification. If you notice an employee is underperforming, as soon as possible, sit down and go through it with them, identifying the problem early on, understanding, is there something impacting it, like a personal issue or a health issue, etc. There might not be any issues around it, but they might be struggling. What is the reason for that underperformance? Again, as obviously it sounds, I don't think many people just wake up in the morning and think, you know what, today I'm just not going to perform and that's me for the future. There's usually something that's triggered it, and it might help them improve. But once you've identified it, talk to them as soon as possible and encourage that open communication, and reassure them that you are there to support them. But anything that they do tell you that might be something quite serious in their own life, that will be treated with confidentiality. So then create that improvement plan, which clearly outlines what the employee needs to do, improve on, how to do it, and when it needs to happen by. Again, it's setting those really clear goals for them, but remember to try and include them in. You will have, try and include them, but you will have things they need to reach as their manager. You know what the business needs, but involving them in the process of setting those goals is likely to make it much more achievable. Think about why they are struggling. Is there any resources or training that they need to help them? Are there any skill gaps that potentially we hadn't noticed before? It's only become apparent when they've moved to that job. Just investigate a little bit more and probe a little bit more and see. It's going to be much better further down the process. Even if things don't go right and that performance doesn't improve, it is going to look a lot better on the organisation, and the employee is going to feel more fairly treated if you've kind of looked at any blockers in their way. And then just on the next slide, we just move on to the next one. There needs to be a capability process in place. So this is the formal process that should follow all the ACAS guidelines. So everything we've talked about up to now has really been around the informal process, but there probably is going to be a point where if their performance doesn't improve, that you have to move to a more formal process. So if that plan is bearing no fruit, your efforts are in vain, you've looked at all the things, there will come a time, how much time will be dependent on the situation. This is again where I said you need to take advice, but there will come a time where you need to think, how does this move forward? So a formal policy needs to lay out exactly how you deal with performance issues when the informal approach does not work. What does that process look like? How many meetings will they have? What could be the possible outcome of that meetings? But the chances that it may result in formal warnings, and that needs to be clearly laid out. But once you flip into that formal process, obviously they've got rights to be accompanied at meetings, they've got rights to appeal any formal warnings, and you know, in the worst case scenario, it could lead to dismissal. But it's important to have that all laid out in the front. One of the last things just to kind of talk about in the underperformance process, and it's something that I feel like we don't use often enough. If someone is not performing in a particular role and not doing particularly well, there's a tendency to just maybe a bit of an unconscious bias to write them off. But look at what role are they in? Is that the right role for them? And I have seen examples of where putting somebody in a different role has really worked. It might be somebody who is, I don't know, in a sales role, and they're not hitting their targets. They're consistently failing against their target. It's very black and white. You go through the informal process, that doesn't work, start on the formal process. But maybe their skills just aren't suited there, but you might see their skills are suited somewhere else. So challenge yourself to think more broadly, and offering alternative employment could really help your case if it ever came to a tribunal, or it might just be the thing that works really well. They might be better suited in a support function like finance, or they might be more suited in operations. So challenge yourself to think broader than just think, right, once we are on this process, this is it, this is out the door because they're not improving, there might be something else to think about. So the last section then is talking about tools to help you streamline your performance management process. And again, I have in the past been part of processes that are very heavily paper-based, and everyone's confused about which piece of paper you fill in when, and you end up with a huge stack of paper that's people kind of shove in the drawer and no one really goes back to. The honest truth is that most effective performance management process are underpinned by some kind of technology, but it's technology that needs to be easy to use workflows for both the managers and the employees. And then when you have got that, you also have data available for the previous year and for years before for organisations to be able to track and monitor what the performance of their people is and how that impacts their business. And I think for us as HR professionals, this has been the key change sort of over the last 20 years in general, of being able to demonstrate value in an objective way by having data about the people in the organisation, whether that's absence data or whether that is performance data. And having that on a system does make life a lot easier, and it allows HR to tell the support story of them being a support function. But the power of technology comes with some kind of self-service for employees to set and track their own goals. And it helps with the continuous improvement process. If that's something that they can monitor as they're going through the year, even if you do have that formal checkpoint at the end of the year, it just makes things a lot easier. Having automated workflows which notify employees and managers when performance reviews are upcoming, what forms do they need to fill in, and providing them with that prompt, that really, really helps. Competency tracking can also be done on technology, and this is looking at the behaviours of people in the organisation, what competences have they got. It helps the organisation look not just across individuals, but the whole wider organisation, certain teams, and looks at areas where you need to improve, maybe there's skill gaps, and it also helps with succession planning and all those good conversations that you need to have as organisations. Having some kind of social stream for employees and managers on technology to give recognition to their colleagues. Most people in your business now are used to social media feeds like Facebook, Instagram, and they're very used to that kind of way of communicating. And particularly as you're getting younger generations coming up, that is generally how they communicate, short, snappy ways of communicating. And having some kind of social stream for recognition and allowing people to do shout outs and thank yous really helps as well. But I think the whole point of having it in one place in technology is that you just get all those goals, competencies, feedbacks from previous reviews, for current reviews. It is just all there in one place and is usually supported by other organisation information. And we all know there's such power in data. I'm stating the absolute obvious, but it really does help in having some kind of system. Now, obviously, there are lots of different types of systems out there. There are huge global ones that are for huge global organisations, and there are sort of, you know, all ends of the spectrum, but some kind of technology really does help underpin it. So then the final point before we move on to questions, we'll just move the slides forward. Yeah, sorry, yeah, so on to Q&A, but just to pull you back to talking about the More Pay Knowledge Centre, we have lots of information on our More Pay Knowledge Centre on our website, which will give you lots of information around things like performance management. We've got lots of articles, blogs, previous webinars, but also the exciting news that we acquired Natural earlier this year, which is a leading HR software organisation. It fits really well with the More Pay aims and brand, and Natural do have a performance management tool process, and we think that these are the sort of the power that we can create going forward, having that things like performance management process, but underpinned by HR professionals. I think there's lots of things there to look forward to. And if anybody has got any questions around More Pay and Natural, then please do not hesitate to contact us either through the chat all through the normal process. So I think, Mark, that's then going to take us on to Q&A. Thank you all very much for listening to today's webinar, and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. As I'm sure everybody would agree, there's plenty of insight there for you. I've had a few questions asking about whether we'll be sharing the PowerPoint slides afterwards, and yes. So by the end of today, we will to everybody that's, whether you've been able to attend or not able to attend or jump off for any reason, yeah, we'll be sending out the slides with the recording of the webinar, which you can watch at your leisure. So yeah, into some of the questions then. Yeah, a few questions around when we're talking about the sort of more informal reviews. I guess how, in terms of how do we sort of approach it initially when you first sort of identify some potential underperformance? Any sort of tips around how you then approach that with your employee?
Yeah, I think one thing that will help going forward is if your organisation gets into the habit of having these kind of conversations on a much more regular basis, it is going to be easier to approach this, because issues can be raised as part of those conversations in a more informal way, and that might be all it needs to be, that corrective action. Actually, I've noticed that you're not doing as much of X. Can we talk about why? What do you need? And it might be by the time you sit down again that the problem's gone away and they just said, oh, I didn't realise there was something I missed. That is going to help longer term. If you're having more regular conversations, you're much more likely to be able to pick up on the smaller things and stop them leading to bigger things. That would be my first big tip. That isn't always the case, and it may be that you've started to notice something. I would still say that even if you don't have regular performance reviews, talk to them about it sooner rather than later. The longer you lead it, the more that problem is going to sort of escalate. And some people think, well, I'll just see if it goes away. Maybe that'll work for a week or two, but if you leave it too long, it is going to turn into a bigger problem. And having a conversation of that bigger problem still got to be had, but it is more difficult. So the biggest tip with that is speak to them as soon as possible. Sit them down, explain to them exactly what you've noticed, exactly why you think it's an issue, and then ask for their feedback. As I said, they might want to give their feedback there and then, or they might want the opportunity to go and wait and think about it. That's absolutely fine. It just depends on how people react. So kind of read their reaction to it. I'd kind of make sure that you've got as much information as possible and stand by your concerns, because even if they turn out to be something that is either very easily rectified or isn't as much of a concern, as managers, sometimes we could probably be a little over apologetic and say, I'm sorry, I really need to talk to you about this. But if it's something you've noticed, you've got to, and just listen to the employee would be my final tip on it.
And I guess one of the concerns, particularly when it comes to addressing underperformance, can be around ensuring you're fully compliant and making being able to avoid tribunals as much as possible. What would be your advice to HR professionals in terms of like documenting those informal discussions?
Yeah, there should always be some kind of documentation of informal discussions, some kind of notes that you can keep between the two of you. Because even further down the line, when you start following that formal position, a tribunal will say, what did you do before? What happened before then? Surely you didn't just step in and give them a warning. There had to be something that happened before. So try and keep some informal notes. Keep the notes objective. What did you talk about? What did you set them? When you're doing anything around performance management, there needs to be a clear, this is what I expect you to do, this is how I expect you to do it, and this is when I expect you to do it by. Even in a more informal setting, there needs to be some kind of record of what you had. And even if it does get rectified very quickly, and it could just be, oh, I didn't realize that I was supposed to do that, I've missed a step, you still need to record it so that the next time you say, no, do you know what, you have improved, what I expected to do has happened, we can move on from this, but you've still got a record. So it's really important to keep records. And even at the informal stage, if you want to seek some further advice from your HR team, if you are in an HR team, and you've got, like, we have in More Pay, the external solicitors, even me as an HR person, there were still times when, even in informal bits, you think, I just need that second opinion. Am I doing the right thing? Because each situation is so unique. It's always worthwhile speaking and getting that second opinion, because at HR, we do default to, okay, if this went to a tribunal, end up in worst case scenario, what sort of questions would I be asked? and then we work back from there.
And earlier on in the webinar, we touched on around some of the tips we shared earlier. We touched on sort of management by objectives. Do you have any guidance on how to work in an working environment where the work and priorities are continually evolving? For example, in a startup environment where you have to regularly adapt?
Yeah, I think you do have to regularly adapt, and that may mean that individual objectives change. And even with my own team, we do set yearly objectives, but we review them formally on a quarterly basis. And we always kind of joke at the beginning of the year that, you know, by the time we sit down in 12 months to do the formal part, these are probably going to look very different because you don't know what's going to come in. Something may come in. The key to being able to manage by objectives where you have got an agile and changing environment is having those regular reviews, so you can start to say, actually, this objective is no longer the priority. Where, you know, you've completed part of it, that's brilliant, and we'll give you the tick up to that part, but we need to adjust it for the rest of the year. It's even more important when businesses have performance reviews that are linked to either pay or bonus payouts. People really need to make sure that they feel that they know exactly what they're doing to achieve it. And I think if you have those regular reviews and those regular checkpoints, you can make those adjustments, and it can become a bit more of a working document. And it can be, okay, we're going to park that objective and we're going to put this one in, but we won't forget about the work you've done on that. We'll come back to it at another point. And it's just having those regular conversations, but not being afraid to change objectives. I think for the most part, a business will set their high level objectives and they'll set a budget and they'll set KPIs of what they want to achieve. And if they are at the right high level, they don't often change. It's the things underneath them that change. What levers do you need to pull to achieve those objectives? They're the things that change. So it's really important for people to feel like they have got power to do that.
And one final one I've seen in here, when it comes to the formal process, it's a question around then going into issuing sanctions. For instance, it says, would we include the disciplinary process then to issue the sanction if there's no improvement within a set time scale?
Yeah, you should have a separate capability process that talks about capability around the job. So it does follow a kind of a disciplinary process, and you really would need to take advice when pulling this process together. But do remember that there's a difference when you're talking about disciplinaries around misconduct. You're talking about something willful. So when somebody has done something that's classed as misconduct, that is deemed to be a willful act. Performance management most of the time isn't willful. There's a lack of capability. For whatever that reason is, there's a lack of capability, and that's why tribunals often look for you to have a separate process. In years gone by, when I first started out in HR, performance management process were kind of tucked in under the disciplinary process, and it was one of the things that was on the list. But over the years, it's been separated out to be a better complete separate process, and I do think that's a good idea to do, to look at the ACAS Code of Practice for Managing Performance and treat it as something that is not willful, and put that process together. But it may end up in the same kind of warnings, but they are separate for, you know, a misconduct issue. If someone's on a misconduct warning, you can't then top it up with the performance ones. That would certainly not be looked at favourably because they are two separate things. And it's important to recognise that they are two separate processes for two different things.
Perfect. Well, I think that's pretty much taken us up to the 45 minutes that we're allocated. So if anybody does have any further questions that they would like to see answered, we don't have time to cover, then by all means, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to help our expert team. But just to quickly touch on the tool, as we mentioned earlier on, Morpay has acquired Natural HR to become a best-of-breed, all-in-one solution for payroll and HR software and services. So yeah, I know that as Michelle has mentioned about some of the pain points that HR can have around performance management. If you want to feel like it's not as much of a tick box exercise, maybe it feels a little outdated, or maybe you're still purely managing on paper. The great thing is with our performance management software, it does the heavy lifting when it comes to managing the admin heavy side of it. With performance, it brings everything together in one view. So you have all the data you need to make valuable business decisions, like who needs further training and support, who is ready for the next step in the career. It empowers your line managers to oversee the whole process for their teams, so you don't have to. or your employees will feel energized by the process rather than see it as just boring admin. These are some of the features our customers love that are on the screen. So if you'd like to chat out more about HR software and see how it can streamline your processes, then please feel free to reach out. And as Michelle also mentioned before, we have our Knowledge Centre on the MorePay website as well, which has a wide variety of webinars, which you'll see Michelle probably hosting a few of them, and also some demos and download guides, blogs, etc. as well for all things payroll and HR, legislation and trending topics. But yeah, that pretty much wraps us up for today. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, Michelle, for giving us your time and your insight. Thank you to everyone for all the questions that you've submitted as well. And hope you enjoy the rest of your Monday.